In this video, we're going to look at a fascinating contrast between Jesus and Peter in John chapter 18. I'm going to show you that in this chapter, Jesus and Peter face the same temptation, but react very differently. And if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm also going to show you a really cool connection between John 18 and John 21. Hey, welcome to Masterpiece. My name is Chris, and in this video, we are back in the Gospels, and this time we're in John chapter 18. So, Gospel of John, chapter 18. Okay, just to situate ourselves, in this chapter, we're already right in the middle of the Passion story. Jesus and his disciples have just eaten the Passover meal together. Jesus has given his farewell discourse and prayed for his disciples. And now in chapter 18, they leave that place and they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is arrested and taken first to the high priest and then to Pilate. But that's not the whole story, because there's another person who plays an important role in this chapter, and that person is Peter. In fact, once you take a closer look and pay attention to repetition, you start to realize that the author actually seems to be comparing Jesus and Peter. Take a look at the first scene in this chapter, for example. So according to verse 1, Jesus and his disciples come to the garden, and then verse 3 says that Judas shows up with a bunch of soldiers to arrest Jesus. Now watch what happens next. John 18, starting in verse 4. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." So notice, twice Jesus asked them whom they are seeking, twice they answer, "Jesus of Nazareth," and twice he says, "I am he." Now maybe you've already noticed that in a number of Bibles, either the word he is cursive, which means it was added by the translators, or you have a footnote that tells you that in the Greek text, Jesus simply says, "I am." And that's quite interesting for at least two reasons. First, because it reminds us of Exodus 3. That's a chapter where Moses is at the burning bush, and God tells him in verse 14 that his name is "I am who I am." So when Jesus says "I am" here in John 18, he's basically implying that he's God, which is why those who came to arrest him fall to the ground in verse 6. But Jesus' answer is also interesting, because this is of course not the first time in the Gospel of John that Jesus has said "I am." Actually, he's been saying it quite a bit. "I'm the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I'm the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life," and so forth. In fact, if you count, there are exactly 7 times in the Gospel of John that Jesus makes an "I am" statement like that. And when you think about it, all of those statements are connected to Jesus' role as Savior, as the one who will give true life to people. So when the group here in chapter 18 say that they're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, and Jesus says "I am," he's not just affirming that he's the one they're looking for, he's actually going beyond that and telling them what his real identity is, even though he knows that in the end, it's precisely this confession that will lead to him being sentenced to death. Okay, but what does all of that have to do with Peter? Well, keep reading. So after the dialogue we just talked about, Jesus gets arrested. They take him to the high priest, but 2 of his disciples follow him. Now look at verse 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Okay, so that was the first denial. Then the story switches back to Jesus, who is questioned by the high priest in verses 19 to 24. And then we get to verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter then denied it again. Very interesting, right? Just like in the other Gospels, here in John, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. But only in 2 instances does he actually speak, and both times he says, "I am not." And it seems like the author intentionally tells the story like that in order to draw a connection to Jesus, who twice says, "I am," just a few verses earlier, in a very similar situation. I mean, think about it. Like Peter, Jesus is in a hostile environment. In fact, he's really in an even worse situation because the people he's interacting with have clearly come to arrest him. And now in that situation, just like with Peter, the issue of his identity comes up, and he's faced with a decision whether or not he should reveal himself, knowing that the way he responds may be a matter of life and death, which means that for both Peter and Jesus, the temptation is great to deny their true identity in order to save themselves. And Peter, of course, ends up doing just that. But the good news is, Jesus doesn't. Where Peter fails, he doesn't. Where Peter tries to save his own skin, Jesus doesn't. He doesn't lie to save himself. He doesn't deny his true identity as God and Savior of the world, but confesses it, which in the end leads him to be condemned to death. And from a purely human perspective, it looks like a bad deal. I mean, sure, Peter lied, but hey, he saved his life. Jesus said the truth and lost his life. But from God's perspective, from the perspective of the gospel, it's the best thing that could have happened, because it's precisely by doing that, by being faithful to his true identity, even in death, that Jesus is able to offer true life to Peter and anyone else who failed like he did. So here's the question. What made the difference? Why did Jesus react like this and Peter like that? I believe the answer lies in what happened previously in the garden. John doesn't talk about this, but the other Gospels do. Both Jesus and Peter are in the garden before the events of John 18, but again, they are acting very differently. Jesus is praying. In fact, he prays 3 times, and in those prayers, he submits himself completely to the Father. And Luke says an angel came down from heaven and strengthened him. But Peter is sleeping. 3 times Jesus comes, and 3 times he finds him sleeping. So 3 times Peter sleeps, 3 times he denies Jesus. And the question is, what would have happened if instead of sleeping, he had prayed 3 times like Jesus? Now, the good news is that the story doesn't end there, because there's one more sequence of 3 in John. I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's a small detail that's mentioned in John 18, which is that Peter's denials happened around a fire of coals. This is again one of those things we tend to not pay much attention to, but it's actually very significant. And one of the reasons for that is that there's only one other place in the entire Gospel of John where a fire of coals is mentioned, and that's in John 21, where the disciples are fishing, and Jesus is standing at the shore, and he tells them to cast the net on the other side, and the disciples recognize him, and when they come back to shore with the 153 fish they caught, it says in verse 9 that there was a fire of coals there, and it's at this fire of coals that Jesus 3 times asks Peter if he loves him. In other words, he takes him back to the place of his greatest failure, not to accuse or condemn him, but to give him an opportunity to make a different decision, to confess his true identity. And you know what? Jesus didn't just deal like that with Peter. He also deals like that with you and me, because that's what he's like. And if you want to see another example of how paying attention to a seemingly insignificant detail in the Bible can lead to some very significant insights about God and his character, then go watch this video next, where I talk about the fascinating connection between Daniel 3 and 4 and what it reveals about God.